Welcome to Chapter 12, The Modern Era. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century was beginning, designers and artists looked for new forms of expression. Art Nouveau proved that invention, rather than duplicating ideas, was a successful way to create. Designers moved from the organic drawing of Art Nouveau into a new design philosophy to address the changing social, economic, and cultural conditions at the turn of the century. We are going to be exploring the innovations made by designers in Scotland, Austria, England, and Germany. So let's begin in Scotland. In Scotland, 4 young artists came together from the Glasgow School of Art to form a group that became nicknamed the Four. These artists were Charles Rennie Mackintosh, J. Herbert McNair, and Margaret and Francis MacDonald. Please make sure you know the designers were part of the group called the Four. Artistic collaboration and friendship led to marriage, and McNair married Francis and Charles married Margaret. They created a unique style of originality and symbolic complexity. Designs by the Four are distinguished by symbolic imagery and stylized form. I want you to make sure that you know the characteristics of graphic designs done by the Four. We're going to discuss this in class, but looking at these 2 examples, how many graphic characteristics can you pick out? For instance, bold lines define flat planes of color. That will give you a clue. Now, German and Austrian artists learned of the Glasgow's movement, and they became celebrated throughout the continent. In England, Talwin Morris established contact with the Four and embraced their ideals. His large volume printer, Blackies, provided Morris with a forum for applying the geometric spatial division and lyrical geometric forms of the Four to mass communications. The volume of his work helped to introduce the English public to Art Nouveau and the new ideas emerging about visual forms in design and architecture. Now, over in Austria, a group of artists broke away from the Viennese Creative Artists Association and formed their own group they called the Vienna Secession. Key members of the group were painter Gustav Klimt, architect Joseph Maria Albrecht, Joseph Hoffmann, and artist-designer Coleman Mosier. Posters of the group show evolution of their style. This is the poster for the first Vienna Secession exhibition. I want you to notice here the trees, because this really wasn't the first poster. It was a redo of this poster, which was really the first one. This poster caused quite an uproar among the censors that they required to reprint it with these black lines covering the male figure's form. Klimt used Greek mythology to show Athena, goddess of the arts, watching Theseus deliver the death blow to the Minotaur. This poster was an allegory of the struggle between the secession and the Viennese Creative Artists Association. Why did these artists form their own guild? And then this poster here, done by Coleman Mosier, is an example of how quickly the forms of Art Nouveau were absorbed, but their love of simple sans serif lettering was a major difference in their style, contrasting with Art Nouveau's letter forms. And here's a slide with some of the pictures of this guild's artists. For a short time as the century began, Vienna was the center for creative innovation in the final blossoming of the Art Nouveau movement. During this time, the Vienna Secession published Sacrum, which means Sacred Spring, from 1898 to 1903. And here's a picture of assorted covers and artists. I want you to be able to tell me what are some of the characteristics of this publication. For instance, Advertisers were required to commission their designs from the artist, and designers contributing to each issue to ensure unity of design. Here's an example of a center spread from this particular magazine, where elemental geometric forms are repeated, building complex kinetic patterns. Here's another spread where a monthly calendar was included. And then here's a couple other pictures. One of this was a poem on the left-hand side, and on the right side, you see the personal monograms of various designers, showing a communal unity in the artistry of the Vienna Secession artists who contributed to Sacrum. These logos represent many different areas, including specialization in architecture, crafts, graphic design, interior design, painting, printmaking, and sculpture. It was truly a collaboration. Alfred Roller also made significant innovations in graphic design. His principal work as a graphic designer and illustrator was for Sacrum, and he did secessionist exhibition posters. I want you to tell me what was Alfred Roller's innovation in graphic design, using these three images as a clue to guide your answer. By 1902, secessionist members Coleman Mosher and Joseph Hoffman launched the Vienna Workshops. This was an outgrowth of the secessionist movement and a spiritual continuation of William Morris's workshops, which sought a close union of pure and applied art in the design of lamps, fabrics, and similar objects for everyday use, including printed items. After 1910, the creative movement in Vienna declined, but the bridge between Art Nouveau and geometric formalism had been crossed. The Vienna Workshop survived World War I, but closed in 1932 because of the Depression era. Peter Behrens was a German artist, architect, and designer. He played a major role in charting a course for design in the first decade of the new century. Initially, he embraced the 1890s German Jugendstil movement. He sought after typographic reform and was an early champion of sans serif typography. He used a grid system to structure space in his designs and was called the first industrial designer due to his designs for manufactured items like street lamps and teapots. These are just some of his contributions. This is an example of a book that he created called The Celebration of Life and Art, done in 1900, and it's a beautiful example of the reforms that he sought in typography. So philosophically, I want you to tell me, what did Peter Behrens feel about typography? Here are the title and dedication pages for Celebration of Life and Art. I want you to look at these images and look at the image on the slide previous to this, and also refer to your textbook so we can discuss what were the innovations in this book. Now, Behrens continued to experiment with sans serif type in formal geometric designs. Typographic reform was one of his major interests, and it was at this point in history when designers really began to look at sans serif letter forms. The Berthold Foundry also began to be interested in sans serif typography, and they designed a family of sans serif fonts which are a variation of this original font. This particular type family had a major influence on sans serif 20th century typography. In 1903, Peter Behrens moved to Dusseldorf to become director of the Dusseldorf School of Arts and Crafts. He ended up meeting a Dutch architect named J.L. Matthau Lawworks, and it was after this that Peter Behrens' work evolved. Lawwork, as you can see here in this figure, used geometric form and developed an approach based on geometric composition. His grids began as a square surrounded by a circle. Numerous variations could be made by subdividing and duplicating the basic structure. The patterns which resulted could be used to determine proportions, dimensions, and spatial divisions in the design of everything from chairs to buildings and graphics. Behrens' application of his process was pivotal in causing 20th century architecture to move towards geometry as a foundation for visual organization. His work at this time was the beginning of something called constructivism in graphic design, and we'll discuss that at a later time. He often used square formats, but also used rectangles by ratios. And the next two images here, you have the Anchor Linoleum Exhibition Pavilion and poster from 1906. Here is a perfect application of Lauwerk's theory, where classical forms and proportions are combined with mathematically derived geometric structure and pattern. This is carried through from the building to the poster. Emil Rathenau was director of AEG, a German electrical company, and he appointed Behrens as its artistic director. As design advisor to AEG, Behrens began to focus on the design needs of industry. This honeycomb design with the firm's initials demonstrates order while being a visual metaphor for the organization of the 20th century corporation. His guide booklet for the 1908 German shipbuilding exhibition was an early application of this logo and corporate typeface that he developed. There are three questions that you need to answer in connection with Peter Behrens and AEG. Who is Emil Rathenau and why is he important? Because he was. What is Peter Behrens' connection to AEG and Emil Rathenau? And why did Peter Behrens do for AEG and why was it so important? Peter Behrens could be called an industrial designer. And with the industrial products designed by Behrens, he brought the formal eye of the painter and the structural approach and professional ethics of the architect to product design. His innovative tea kettles had interchangeable parts. And here's an example of the tea kettle itself. He also developed lamps. His arc lamps produce intense light by passing a current between two carbon electrodes. In this lamp design, shape and proportion are inspired by ancient Greek vases. This poster designed by Behrens in 1910 demonstrates the typographic and spatial parameters of the mature AEG corporate identification program. Geometric elements structure space and signify the radiant energy of illumination. And this is just personally, to me, one of the most beautiful designs I think that I've ever seen. AEG's corporate design program was extended to architecture, including storefronts and a turbine hall. The turbine hall's architecture is designed to suggest its function, a large industrial factory engineered for the assembly of giant steam turbines. In London at the beginning of the 20th century, the Underground Electric Railways of London consolidated much of London's urban transportation system. Frank Pick, who worked for the Underground Group, played the same role as Emil Rathenau and AEG in bringing the London Underground Group to the forefront in innovative publicity and design. He started with having a new font design. He moved on to signage and did much, much more. So what else did Frank Pick do for London's Underground Electric Railway? So in conclusion, in the late 19th and early 20th century, pioneering designers in Germany, Scotland, and Austria broke with Art Nouveau to chart new directions in response to personal and societal needs. Their work was the foundation for design in the new century. Their artistic explorations and philosophies coursed through design activities in the decades ahead.